For some reason, most public speaking books like building your speech with the outline and organizing it right before they put introduction, transitions, and conclusions. And that's always been a bit confusing to me, but let's dive in, take a look at introducing, transitions, and conclusions. The brain remembers the emotional component of experience more than any other aspect. And that is the reason why getting that emotion early in your speech truly connects to your audience and draws them in, so that way you have that connection that keeps them interested and awake through the whole speech. What we'll be talking about in this chapter, of course, is introducing your speech, the transitions that occur in between your speeches and in between the main points. Finally, we'll be drawing it all together with conclusions. Let's start by breaking from the book. My favorite thing, I think, at times. Uh, let's remember back when we did our audience analysis and when we talked about our audience gets a mental picture of what a speaker should be and what they should look like. And if you know that about your audience, that gives you a foot up on getting that introduction, getting that attention-getting device that draws them in. Because by knowing this, you can surprise them. You can do something out of the ordinary, something they're not expecting. That wakes them up right at the beginning of your speech and gets them emotionally connected to you to follow you throughout the speech. Be unique is always the best advice. Of course, you do always have to look at that situation. Remember your audience analysis, looking at what's expected of you. And some situations you don't want to be unique because it just would be rude or impolite. So absolutely, uniqueness works when you're in the proper format. And at other times, like at a wedding, for instance, you don't want to go too crazy because, once again, the spotlight is your audience, not you. Now back to the book. What we really want to look at in this first part of introducing your speech is, what is your goals? Your goal is to establish a goodwill with the audience, to have that good first impression. Because if that audience has that good impression of you, they're going to have empathy for you, they're going to support you, and they're going to be rooting for you. If you don't make that initial good impression, yeah, you have to build that up through the speech, and you're already behind. Next, you want to establish your credibility. Why should they listen to you? Why should they pay attention? What experiences, what knowledge are you sharing? Explain your purpose. All three of these are your initial goals of your speech. The attention-getting device. You know, the first thing you have to really do is grab your audience's attention. You might be the third speaker, you might be the fifth speaker, you might be the first speaker, you might be the last speaker. It all depends, but no matter what, your audience either could have suffered through a lot of poor speeches up until you, and boy, you need to really kind of jar them back awake, or perhaps they've had great speeches up to you and you have to keep the momentum going. The attention getter is that initial, all right, audience, here I am, let's go. You want to use quotations. Quotations, you absolutely borrow ethos from other people. When you quote a famous person, Mark Twain, Abraham Lincoln, JFK, Martin Luther King, any of these individuals, when you borrow a quote from them, you're taking a little bit of their credibility and kind of wearing it. And that actually is a very good way, and it develops respect from the audience. Acknowledging the speaking situation. You know, it's kind of we're in the whole boat together aspect of it. So if you're speaking at a location and something's been going on, maybe you're at a huge concert venue and there's been some great performances, kind of saying, you know, I've really had a great weekend. This has been a lot of fun. So you acknowledge what's going on for the audience with the audience. And this makes you kind of part of them and really does help create a bond. Rhetorical question. This became a huge thing in the 90s. Every comedian seemed to be starting all their skits and all their stand-up with a rhetorical question. Have you ever noticed? Type of thing. And that rhetorical question kind of leads you in. So rhetorical questions are good. Visualization. Visualization works very well. You know, Visualize a world without springs. If we didn't have springs, we wouldn't have watches. We wouldn't have watch, and we wouldn't have a couch. We wouldn't have. So you can do a visualization, kind of the dystopian world, or a really positive one. Imagine if we all to get together and shared our positive energy. Visualization, storytelling, or joke. Storytelling I always recommend, because storytelling, what it really does is it allows the audience to see your perspective. It brings them in like a good movie, like a good book, and allows them to visualize that they're standing with you. And when they're with you, yeah, they're on your side. You got them. So absolutely, storytelling. Jokes can be a hit or miss. Some people like me, I end up usually telling dad jokes because, yeah, even though you expected a dad joke, and so it kind of works out. Jokes, though, make sure you're following that you want to have an inclusive audience. You want to include, not exclude people. So you want to make maybe a joke about yourself, maybe about your clothing, maybe about your day, but you don't want to make jokes at your audience because that really kind of separates you. Startling information, a statistic or a fact. This is always good. If you can throw up a stat, before 1970, only 5% of people wore seat belts. And when only 5% of people wore seat belts, the death toll per car accident was. And that can be startling. And now, in 2022, 95% of people wear seat belts. And your chance of dying in an automobile accident has decreased. Automatically, your audience is like, oh yeah, let me process that. Wow, that's something I didn't know. And they are appreciative of it, and it kind of brings them in. After that, you want to have your thesis statement. We've talked about that a lot, so I'm not going to go a lot into that. Remember, a couple quick sentences. What it is about. What is your speech about? And what side are you taking? Are you for something? Are you against it? Are you suggesting a new idea, a new approach? So absolutely the thesis statement. Now, the next two you don't always use in every speech you do. A speech of introduction or a celebratory speech, those type of speeches don't require this, but an informative speech and your persuasive speech both require a justification. Why should the audience care? Okay, you're telling me about a fungus that you find in the northern mountains of Washington State. I'm in Colorado, why do I care? So you need that justification tied in there. Next, your credibility. Well, who are you to tell me about this mountain fungus? You look like someone that's from Colorado. What do you know about mountain funguses? At that point, you can say, I've written these books or I've done this research. Credibility becomes an important part of your audience continuing to pay attention. Then go into your preview. With your preview, what you've done is you're telling your audience what you're going to tell them. At that point, they know, yeah, I need to pay attention because I want to learn these things. This is going to be good speech. So that preview helps keep your audience paying attention to your main points. When you're going to move to the body of the speech, what do you have to have? A transition. And with your transition, you have one moving from the introduction into the body and from the body into the conclusion. But in the body, you have multiple ones between main points. What you want to do is you want to avoid filler words. And sometimes a filler word can come up with the word and. And now, and now, and now, and now. Next, next, next. Those start to become filler words when you overuse them, even though they are a good transition if used sparingly. You want to have a theme when you have a transition. In other words, you want to be saying the first thing we want to talk about, the second thing, and the third thing. Point A, point B, point C. Our main topic, our next topic, our final topic. Things of that variety. That's kind of a theme where you're repeating the same type of transition throughout the body of the speech. What you don't want to have is, well, my first point and B point is, and my final point is, see how it kind of doesn't fit. So you want to maintain that. Of course, you can enumerate it with having first, second, third. Those are always fine. When you're doing those, though, you can also reinforce previous points that you've made to help move that information from short-term knowledge into long-term. And by doing this, you're going to have an internal preview, or you can have an internal summary or review. Now that we have talked about my first point, let's look at my second point. Now we've reached our third point, let's not forget what we learned in our first and second point. As you can see, these help kind of repeat the information so your audience remembers it. Road signs. I always like to throw this in because you should think of your transition as your road signs. If you've ever picked up a map and looked at it and it's confusing, it's probably because they didn't keep to the same theme or they didn't road sign it. I remember one time I was given directions in rural Georgia. He said, now I want you to go down this street and I want you to turn left where the church used to be. How will I know a church was there when it's no longer there? So your road signs need to make sense. So it should be, I want you to turn at the 7-Eleven, which is still there, and go this direction. So make sure your road signs are clear so your audience follows your speech and gets to where they're going, where you want to take them. With the conclusion is very important because of that recency effect that we talked about. People remember the most recent thing that they heard, all right? Now, normally they'll remember a lot of the early part of the speech because they haven't filled up their memory yet. They're still like, oh, I still got a little bit of a blank sheet here, and you're putting information. And then when you get to the middle part, well, you got a lot of information, and now you're trying to put more stuff in, but you're going to overwrite that stuff because you're going to go to the conclusion, which will have the recency effect. So with your conclusion, you want to make sure you signal it. Now that we've talked about my three main points, let's bring this to an end. Let's conclude with, let's remember, let's take away from this speech. All those are a good way to signal you're coming to the conclusion. Remember, give that only once to your poor audience. I think many of us have been to graduation ceremonies where the main speaker signals their ending more than once. And once they signal the ending the first time, the audience starts grabbing their stuff, getting ready to walk across the stage and graduate. And then they don't get a chance to get up there because that was a false signal. And then they do it a second time. This time you kind of reach. And then when they finally reach their conclusion, you're like, oh, it's over. Oh, when you're kind of shocked. So remember, signal it one time so that way when you get there, they know. Summary and review. That's important for that recency effect. All right, you told them what you're going to tell them. You told it to them. And now you're going to tell them what you told them. This brings it full circle, which is a break from the book. The book doesn't always mention this. This is a way to conclude is when you bring your thesis statement from the very beginning and you bring it down to the end. Remember, I was going to tell you about, and now that I've told you about that, I hope you can see my point. Boom. That brings it full circle. Now you need a closing note or a mic drop. Something that lets your speech play on after you're done talking. And that's something that your audience contemplates, thinks about, or remembers. And that mic drop is that opportunity. What you want with your mic drop ideas, a good quote. I always like throwing a quote in. You've noticed I do that in all my presentations here for class because I'm trying to give a little bit of latent learning where I'm showing you by actually doing. And that's why all my speeches, all my presentations for the class are outlined the same way. But that quote, that's a solid way to bring it to an end. Visualization. Now that we've talked about the importance of, you can imagine a world where, that visualization, they'll leave the speech kind of like a good song where they visualize the music. So a good visualization absolutely works. A call to question. My question to you as we leave is, what would happen if we don't do what we talked about? You're going to think about that on the way out. Great way. Call to action. Now that I've told you this, what I need you to do is, boom. A choice. Going forward, we have a choice to do something or do nothing. What's your choice? Complete a story. One of the TED Talks I use, what the presenter does is he begins with a story, then goes into his main points, and then brings a conclusion where he finishes that story that he began with. That's a way to do it, and it's a nice way to kind of bring it full circle and to keep your audience paying attention throughout your speech. Tell a short story. Now that I've done this, what I have found in my life is, and you can tell a story about it, or a shocking statistic. That can actually tie into multiple of these. If we don't do this, statistics show that this is what we can expect inflation to look like in 5 years. Whatever you're going to do. But a shocking stat at the end is another way to keep them thinking about your speech after you're done talking. What we talked about: introducing your speech, transition, and conclusions. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. Remember, a good speech is like a pencil. It has to have a point. And in this case, that point is truly that mic drop. If you can get their attention early and you can transition and keep them following you, make sure it's a payoff for your audience. So that way, when your speech is done, they're thinking about the point you made.